Walter Bennett sat by the window, staring at the autumn leaves swirling in the crisp afternoon breeze. The golden light of the setting sun cast long shadows across his quiet living room, where time itself seemed to stand still. His hands, weathered by years of photography, gently held an old faded picture, his wife Margaret smiling at him from a moment frozen in time. She had been gone for 3 years now. Yet the house still held her presence, the scent of lavender lingering on the old cushions, the delicate porcelain teacup she used every morning still sitting by the kitchen sink, untouched. Walter hadn't changed a thing. He couldn't. He refused. If he kept everything exactly as it was, maybe, just maybe, he could stop time from taking more away from him. But time is not something one can bargain with. Outside, a gust of wind knocked a branch against the window. Walter flinched, startled from his thoughts. His gaze drifted back to the photograph in his hands. The colors had faded, the edges curling slightly. Even this, one of his most treasured memories, was slipping away. His chest tightened with an ache he had long learned to ignore. "Nothing lasts forever," he muttered under his breath. A knock at the door pulled him from his trance. It was Elliot, an old friend, a fellow photographer, and a man who had walked the Buddhist path for years. With a warm smile, Elliot stepped inside, taking in the room that had become Walter's self-imposed museum of the past. "You're still keeping everything just the way it was," Elliot said gently. Walter exhaled. "I just don't want to let go." Elliot sat across from him, pouring tea into 2 cups. He took a sip before speaking. "Walter, do you remember when we used to chase sunsets? How we'd rush to capture the perfect shot before the light disappeared?" Walter nodded. "Of course, the light was everything." Elliot smiled. "And yet, no matter how perfect it was, it always faded." He set his cup down. "But that never stopped us from enjoying the moment, did it?" Walter looked away. He knew what Elliot was trying to say. "Walter," Elliot continued, "have you ever tried to hold on to a river?" The question lingered in the air like a whisper of wind through autumn leaves. Walter frowned, but he didn't answer. Something about the way Elliot said it made him uneasy, as if he had just been handed a truth he wasn't ready to face. Change was coming, whether he was ready for it or not. But was it possible that letting go didn't mean losing everything? Perhaps, just perhaps, it was time to find out. If you've ever struggled with change, with loss, or with the fear of letting go, Walter's journey might resonate with you. His story is one of learning, of accepting, and ultimately of finding peace in the nature of impermanence. Stay with us as we explore the wisdom of change, the beauty of the fleeting moment, and the profound truth that nothing, no pain, no joy, no moment, lasts forever. Subscribe to Buddhist life philosophy for more inspiring stories and timeless wisdom. Let's walk this journey together. Walter woke up to the sound of rain tapping gently against the window. The morning light, muted and grey, seeped through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. He lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, feeling the familiar weight pressing against his chest, a weight that had been with him since Margaret passed. He turned his head toward her side of the bed. It remained untouched, just as she had left it. The blanket was still neatly tucked, her favorite book still resting on the nightstand, a pair of reading glasses folded carefully on top. He hadn't moved them. He couldn't. It felt wrong, as if rearranging anything would erase the last traces of her presence. Slowly, he pushed himself up and shuffled to the kitchen. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. He reached for the coffee pot, pouring himself a cup, the way he used to pour one for Margaret every morning. He caught himself mid-motion, glancing at her empty chair across the table. He hesitated, then set the second cup down anyway. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving behind the scent of damp earth and fresh beginnings. But to Walter nothing felt new. Everything was just a quieter version of yesterday. Later that afternoon, he found himself in the attic, searching for an old photo album. The wooden floor creaked beneath his steps as he pulled open a dusty box. His fingers brushed against something familiar, a framed photograph of him and Margaret taken on their honeymoon. She was laughing, Her eyes crinkled with joy as she leaned into him. He remembered that moment vividly, the salty breeze, the warmth of her hand in his, the way she had looked at him as if nothing else in the world mattered. But now the colors had faded. The edges were worn. Time had been quietly stealing it away, just as it had stolen her. A deep ache spread through his chest. He gripped the frame tighter, as if holding on to it could somehow bring her back. His throat tightened. The thought of moving on felt like a betrayal, as if accepting her absence meant she had never truly mattered. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Elliot stood outside, his ever-calm presence a stark contrast to the storm raging inside Walter's mind. "I was in the neighborhood," he said with a knowing smile. "Thought I'd drop by." Walter stepped aside, letting him in. Elliot's eyes swept across the room, taking in the preserved fragments of the past. He didn't say anything, but Walter could feel the weight of his gaze. "I don't know how to move forward," Walter admitted after a long silence. "I don't even know if I want to." Elliot nodded, as if he understood something Walter had yet to grasp. "You know, I once tried to hold on to sand," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I was at the beach scooping up a handful, but the tighter I held on, the faster it slipped through my fingers." He paused. "It's strange, isn't it? We think holding on means keeping something close, but sometimes it just makes it disappear faster." Walter exhaled sharply. He wanted to argue, to insist that love was different, that memories were different. But deep down he knew Elliot was right. He had been clenching his fists around a past that was slipping away regardless. Elliot leaned forward, his voice gentle. "Walter, do you think Margaret would want you to live like this? Frozen in time, afraid to move, afraid to feel anything new?" Walter looked away. He didn't have an answer. "Change isn't the enemy," Elliot continued. "It's just life. The river doesn't fight the current, Walter. It flows with it." Walter swallowed hard. He had spent years resisting, refusing to let go, believing that holding on to the past was the only way to honor it. But what if honoring it meant something else? What if it meant carrying it forward instead of standing still? He looked at the photograph in his hands once more. For the first time, he saw it not as something slipping away, but as something that had been. Something beautiful. Something real. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Elliot stood. "Come, on," he said, gesturing toward the door. "Let's take a walk. The air is fresh after the rain." Walter hesitated, then set the photograph down, not hidden away in a box, but placed gently on the table beside him. He reached for his coat, the fabric familiar beneath his fingers. Outside, the world smelled of wet earth and fallen leaves. The air was crisp, cool against his skin. As they walked, Walter glanced up at the sky. The clouds were parting, revealing glimpses of blue. The storm had passed, and for the first time in a long while, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he was ready to let the river carry him forward. The afternoon air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Walter walked beside Elliot along the narrow path leading toward the lake. The sky had cleared after the rain, but the ground was still soft beneath their steps. Walter hadn't set foot in this park in years. Margaret used to love coming here, sitting by the water's edge, watching the seasons change. He had avoided it ever since she passed, unwilling to face the ghosts of memories lingering in the air. Elliot walked in silence, letting Walter take in the surroundings. The trees that lined the path were shedding their golden leaves, each one drifting slowly to the ground before being carried away by the breeze. Walter watched as a leaf detached from a branch, fluttering gently before settling into the stream beside them. The water took it without resistance, guiding it along the rippling current. Elliot finally spoke. "Look at that leaf, Walter. Just a few weeks ago it was part of the tree, vibrant and full of life. Now it drifts away, not clinging, not resisting. Do you think the tree mourns its loss?" Walter exhaled, watching the leaf disappear downstream. "No, I suppose not." Elliot smiled faintly. "It doesn't because it understands something we often forget. Change is natural. The leaf was never meant to stay forever. It served its purpose, and now it's moving on to the next stage, returning to the earth to nourish the roots that will bring forth new leaves in the spring." Walter remained quiet, He knew Elliot was speaking of more than just trees. They reached the lake, its surface smooth and glass-like, reflecting the sky above. Walter remembered sitting here with Margaret, watching the sunset paint the water in hues of gold and crimson. It was always changing, never the same from one evening to the next. He had admired it then, never once wishing it would stay frozen, in time. Yet with Margaret he had tried to do exactly that, hold on to something that by its very nature could not remain unchanged. Elliot picked up a small stone and tossed it into the lake. Ripples expanded outward, distorting the reflection, before gradually fading. "Even the stillest water is always moving," he said. "It may look calm, but underneath it's constantly shifting, adapting, flowing. Life is the same way." Walter watched the ripples disappear, leaving the lake just as it was before. He thought about the way he had fought against change, how he had refused to let go, as if resisting time itself would somehow bring Margaret back. But the truth was, no matter how tightly he had held on, life had moved forward without him. He had been standing still, locked in a moment that no longer existed, while the world around him continued to change, just as it always had. A flock of birds soared overhead, their wings cutting gracefully through the open sky. Walter followed, their flight, remembering something Margaret had once told him. "Birds never fight the wind," she had said, watching them glide effortlessly. "They trust it to carry them where they need to go." He felt a sudden ache in his chest. Not the sharp pain of loss, but something softer, something almost peaceful. Perhaps Margaret had understood something he hadn't. She had lived fully, embracing each moment, never trying to hold on to what she knew was meant to pass. Maybe that was why she had always seemed so light, so free. Walter turned to Elliot. "I've spent so much time fighting change. I thought if I held on tightly enough, I could keep everything the way it was. But all I did was make myself miserable." Elliot nodded, his expression gentle. "Holding on doesn't preserve what we love, Walter. It only makes it harder to appreciate what we still have." Walter looked back at the water, at the endless movement beneath its surface. He thought of the seasons shifting, the leaves falling, the birds trusting the wind. He thought of Margaret, of the love they had shared, of the memories that still lived within him. Maybe letting go didn't mean losing. Maybe it meant allowing things to be as they were always meant to be, beautiful, fleeting, and free. The sun was beginning to set, casting golden light across the lake. For the first time in years, Walter didn't feel the urge to capture it, to freeze it in time. Instead, he simply watched, allowing himself to be present, to witness the moment for what it was, temporary, ever-changing, and breathtakingly beautiful. And for the first time, he didn't feel afraid. The air inside Walter's house felt different when he returned that evening. It was the same place, the same walls, the same quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. And yet, something had shifted. Maybe it was him. He moved slowly, through the living room, trailing his fingers along the edges of the old wooden furniture. Everything was exactly as it had been for years, untouched, frozen in time. But now, for the first time, he saw it differently. The dust had settled over, the framed photographs on the mantel. He picked one up, the picture of him and Margaret on their wedding day. He had always thought of it as timeless, a moment captured forever. But now he noticed the fine cracks in the glass, the way the once vivid colors had faded. He saw himself. In that photo, young and full of life, a man who had once believed in endless tomorrows. He exhaled. Time had not only changed the world around him, it had changed him too. He sat down slowly, rubbing his hands together. They had grown thinner over the years, the veins more prominent, the skin marked with deep lines. When had that happened? When had the hands that once held a camera steady, that once reached for Margaret's with effortless familiarity, become these hands, worn, fragile, no longer belonging to the man in the photograph? His breath caught for a moment. It was so easy to see impermanence in the world outside, the falling leaves, the shifting sky, the changing seasons. But to see it within himself was something else entirely. He had spent so much time resisting change, but the truth was it had been happening all along. Whether he accepted it or not, his body, his mind, his very existence had never remained the same for even a moment. A deep sigh left his lips, and for a while he just sat there, watching the rise and fall of his own breath. It was something Eliot had mentioned earlier about how even the stillest water was always moving. Walter had always assumed that stillness meant permanence, but now, sitting in his chair watching the subtle movement of his chest as he breathed, he understood. Even when everything seemed quiet, change was happening. Right now, in this very moment, he was changing. Cells were dying and regenerating, thoughts were appearing and fading. He closed his eyes. For years, he had avoided acknowledging this. He had believed that if he held on tightly enough to Margaret's things, to his past, to his identity as a husband, a photographer, a man who once had more time, he could keep himself intact. But now, sitting in the dim light of his living room, he saw that the self he had been clinging to was already gone, and yet somehow he was still here. He took a slow breath, deeper this time, letting the air fill his lungs before releasing it. He listened to it, felt it, noticed how no two breaths were ever the same. Some were shallow, others deeper. Some carried tension, others a strange kind of relief. But none of them lasted. They came, they passed, and they made room for the next. Memory surfaced. Margaret sitting across from him one morning, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. She had smiled at him, her face soft with understanding. "You don't have to hold on so tightly, Walter," she had said. "Just be here." "That's enough." He opened his eyes. The grandfather clock chimed softly in the distance. He looked at his hands again, but this time he didn't see loss. He saw years of life lived, of love given and received, of change embraced, even when he hadn't realized it. Maybe he had spent too much time mourning what was gone, instead of appreciating what remained. He stood up, walked to the window and looked outside. The leaves that had fallen earlier were still there, scattered across the lawn. He would rake them tomorrow, or maybe he wouldn't. Either way, more would fall. The tree would grow new ones in the spring. Life would go on, and so would he. The next morning, Walter stepped outside for the first time in what felt like forever. The crisp autumn air greeted him, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant aroma of burning wood from a neighbor's fireplace. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, feeling the coolness settle into his skin. The world outside had changed overnight. More leaves had fallen, covering the ground like a golden carpet, and the air had that unmistakable stillness that always came before winter. He stood on the porch for a long time, his hands resting on the wooden railing. The house behind him felt different, lighter, though nothing had physically changed. It was something within him that had shifted. For years he had treated this place as a shrine to the past, afraid that moving forward meant letting go of Margaret, but something in him finally understood. Moving forward didn't mean forgetting. It meant carrying her with him in a different way. His eyes landed on the garden bed by the walkway, the one Margaret used to tend to every morning. Overgrown now, weeds creeping into the once perfect rows, it had become a quiet reminder of all the things he had let wither alongside himself. He knelt down slowly, fingers brushing against the soil. It was firmer than he remembered, packed, tight from months of neglect. He ran his hands through it, feeling its rough texture, and then, without thinking, he began pulling at the weeds, clearing the space inch by inch. He wasn't sure how long he stayed there, but by the time he stood, a small patch of soil was free, exposed once more to the light. His knees ached, his fingers were dirt-streaked, but for the first time in a long while he felt something other than heaviness. He felt present. Later that afternoon, he found himself at his desk, a pen in his hand, a blank sheet of paper before him. It had been years since he had written to his son. The last time had been an obligatory holiday card, short and impersonal. There had been a time when they had been close, but after Margaret's passing, Walter had pushed him away. Not intentionally, but in the quiet, painful way that grief isolates. He hesitated, the weight of so many unspoken words pressing down on him. Then, slowly, he began to write. "Michael, it's been too long. That's my fault. I convinced myself that holding on to the past meant keeping your mother close, but I see now that I was only holding myself apart. from you, from life, from everything she would have wanted for me. I don't want to live like that anymore. I miss you. If you have time, I'd like to see you. He signed his name and stared at the letter for a long moment before carefully folding it and slipping it into an envelope. He didn't know if Michael would write back. But that wasn't the point. The act of reaching out, of opening the door even just a little, was enough. That evening he brewed a cup of tea, the way Margaret had always done. He sat by the window, watching the last light of day fade into twilight. He had spent so many nights like this before, but tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't waiting for something to come back. He wasn't mourning what had been lost. He was simply here, in this moment, watching the sky change, feeling the warmth of the cup in his hands, listening to the quiet rhythm of his own breath. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to just be, and somehow that was enough. Walter sat on his porch as the first hints of winter settled into the air. The garden, once neglected, now showed signs of renewal, small green shoots pushing up from the soil where he had cleared the weeds. He didn't know if they would bloom before the frost arrived, but somehow that no longer seemed to matter. Growth wasn't always immediate. Some things took time. The letter to Michael had been sent a week ago, and though he had yet to receive a response, he no longer found himself waiting anxiously by the mailbox. He had done what he could, extended his hand across the distance he had created. That was enough. Whether his son chose to reach back was not something he could control. For so long he had fought against time, against change, believing that holding on tightly to the past was the only way to honor it. But life had continued to move, with or without his permission. The seasons had shifted, the leaves had fallen, and somewhere along the way so had his resistance. He had come to see that impermanence wasn't something to fear. It was what gave each moment meaning. He thought of Margaret, of her laughter echoing through the years, of the way she had embraced life so fully. She had understood something he had taken so long to learn, that clinging to what was would only blind him to what still remained. And there was still so much left. The world was changing, and for the first time Walter was changing with it. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, feeling the coolness of the air filling his lungs before releasing it slowly. His breath, ever present, ever changing, reminded him that he was still here, still living. He smiled, not because everything was perfect, not because he had found some final resolution, but because he had learned to let go, not with sadness, but with gratitude. And perhaps, in the end, that was all that was needed. Life is always moving, shifting, changing. We can resist it, fight against the current, or we can learn to flow with it. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means making space for new beginnings, for growth, for peace. If Walter's story spoke to you, take a moment to reflect. What are you holding on to? What are you afraid to release? Remember, everything, pain, joy, love, loss, is part of life's constant transformation. If you found wisdom in this journey, subscribe to Buddhist life philosophy for more stories that inspire and bring peace. Together, let's learn to embrace the beauty of impermanence.